For this exercise, we are given the lengths of the sides of quadrilateral PQRS, and we are also given the slopes of the sides of quadrilateral PQRS. Armed with that information, we are supposed to figure out what type of quadrilateral it is, and we are supposed to classify. That just means say what type it is. Of course, the options are: is it a parallelogram, trapezoid, or kite? Is it a rectangle or rhombus? Is it an isosceles trapezoid, or is it a square? So that's 7. There's 7 possibilities that we have to be as specific as possible. Please understand, if you decide that the best you can do is classify as a parallelogram, you must indicate why it is not a rectangle or rhombus. If you decide that it's a rectangle, you have to say why it's not a square. If you decide that it's a rhombus, you have to say why it is not a square. If you decide it's a trapezoid, you have to say why it is not an isosceles trapezoid. All right? If you say that it's a kite, you're done. There's nothing more specific. If you say it's an isosceles trapezoid, you're done. If you say it's a square, you're done. But if you pick any of the other things, you have to say why you are not going more specific with it. Watch out for that. Okay, in problem number 4, we're looking at these distances and slopes. This is what I want you to think in your mind. The first decision is it a parallelogram, trapezoid, or kite? Forget about the 7. Just focus on the 3 possibilities. It's either a parallelogram, a trapezoid, or a kite. Let's start with parallelogram. If something is a parallelogram, the opposite sides will be congruent and parallel. Okay, so looking at these, look at the distances, the lengths. Are opposite sides congruent? Well, because the sides are listed in order, PQ, QR, RS, PS, we know that if we look at every other row, we are looking at opposite sides. So these are opposite sides. And look at that, radical 13, radical 13. Those are congruent. Also look at these slopes, 2/3 and 2/3. Those are parallel. So far so good. Opposite sides are congruent and parallel, same slope. Also, looking at opposite sides by skipping rows one more time, QR and PS would be opposite sides. And again, we have radical 10 and radical 10. Opposite sides are congruent. Again, we have negative 1/3 and negative 1/3. Opposite sides are parallel. So this is a parallelogram. So far so good. So we can forget about trapezoid and kite. All right? Now that we know that it's a parallelogram, the question is, can we go more specific? Is it a rectangle? Is it a rhombus? Let's start with rhombus because that's the easiest to see. If this, what is the definition of a rhombus? Yeah, if it's a rhombus, it should have 4 congruent sides. All right, because that's the definition of a rhombus. Does this have 4 congruent sides? No. I have radical 13 and radical 10. So this is not a rhombus. Okay? Is it a rectangle? Is this parallelogram a rectangle? Well, remember, what's the definition of a rectangle? If it's a rectangle, it should have 4 right angles. Okay, we're talking about 90 degrees. Okay, so if something is a rectangle, it should have 90-degree angles everywhere. Now, 90-degree angles means that these sides should be perpendicular. Now, how should the slopes look? How should the slopes compare if we look at consecutive sides right next to each other? If these are perpendicular, how should the slopes compare? For example, if one side has a slope of 2/3, the other side should have a slope of -3/2, right? The words we use are opposite sign and reciprocal. That's what the slope should look like if they're perpendicular. And that's what would happen if these were right angles, But these are not reciprocal. They're opposite sign, but 2/3, 1/3, those are not reciprocal. So no, this is not a rectangle. That means the best classification we can do is parallelogram. So we're going to write parallelogram for the answer, and we have to say why we chose parallelogram. But don't forget, we also have to say why it's not a rectangle and not a rhombus. Okay? Alright, so right here we will say what we chose. We decided to go with parallelogram. Okay, that was our best classification. Now here comes the explanation. The best thing to do when you write your explanation is to use the definition. The definition of a parallelogram is both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. So we could just say it's a parallelogram because both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. Of course, we knew that, but from looking at the slopes and seeing that the opposite sides have the same slope. Now, we also have to say why it's not a rectangle and not a rhombus. Now, we could write that in words, or we can just indicate that on the chart. Here's how you would indicate it on the chart. Let's start with why it's not a rhombus. If it were a rhombus, all four sides would be congruent. So to demonstrate that it's not a rhombus, all you really have to do is point out two sides that are not congruent. So if I circle the radical 13 and a radical 10 here, I can just simply go ahead and say not a rhombus. Okay, it's not a rhombus because those are not congruent. Now, the reason why I knew that this was not a rectangle was because these should have been perpendicular, opposite and reciprocal, and they're not. So again, I could write a sentence about that, or I could just circle these and make a side note saying not a rectangle. Okay, by circling these slopes and saying it's not a rectangle, I'm going to believe that you mean that you recognize that these slopes should be opposite and reciprocal, and they're not. Okay, of course, if you wanted to write it out in sentences, here's how you would do that. You could say that it's not a rectangle because consecutive sides are not perpendicular. You still have to mention why it's not a rhombus. You could say it is not a rhombus because it does not have four congruent sides. They're different. Alright, let's look at problem number 3. Did I say number 3? I meant number 5. Okay, here's problem number 5. And again, our first job is to decide if this is a parallelogram, trapezoid, or kite. Let's start with parallelogram. If this is a parallelogram, opposite sides should be congruent and opposite sides should be parallel, same slope. Well, all of the sides have length radical 10. That means opposite sides are congruent. So it is a parallelogram. Also, look at the slopes. 3 and 3. Opposite sides are parallel. Negative 1/3 and negative 1/3. Opposite sides are parallel. So it's definitely a parallelogram again. So once again, is not a trapezoid, is not a kite. But now that we know it's a parallelogram, we have to decide, is it a rectangle? Is it a rhombus? Let's start with rectangle. Well, you know what? Let's start with rhombus because that's the most obvious. If it's a rhombus, it's going to have 4 congruent sides. Does it have 4 congruent sides? Well, it sure does. Radical 10 4 times. So, kabam, it is a rhombus. So, parallelogram, check. Rhombus, check. Okay? So far, we know that it's a rhombus. Okay? We can kind of forget about parallelogram because rhombus is the more specific choice. But it's possible that it is also a rectangle. And of course, if it's also a rectangle, that makes it a square. So in other words, we know it's a rhombus, but we need to see if it's a square now. Is it also a square? Well, if it's a square, it's going to have those 4 right angles. Okay? If you got a square, okay, this is my square. But if this is a square, then this is going to be a 90-degree angle. Okay, all of these will be 90-degree angles if this is a square. Okay? So, if these are 90-degree angles, the slopes, these are perpendicular lines. And the slopes should be opposite and reciprocal. Here I have 3, and then the next consecutive one is negative 1/3. Are these perpendicular? Yes. They are opposite sign and reciprocal. 3/1, 1/3. Okay, and of course it's the same down here. These are opposite sign reciprocal, and these are opposite sign reciprocal. So we do indeed have 4 right angles. So that means this is a square. So once we realize that it's a square, then we can forget about rhombus, and we're just going to classify it as a square. Okay, so coming back to the answer page here, we're going to classify it as a square. Now it's time for the explanation. And here's your explanation. It is a square because it has 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles. That's just the definition of a square. That's the easiest thing to do. Now, notice I don't have to say that it's not something else, because looking back at this diagram, square is the end of the line. There's nothing more specific than a square. So if you go with square, you don't have to say that it's not something else. All right, let's take a look at the last one, number 6. All right, here's number 6. The first thing we need to do is decide, is this a parallelogram, a trapezoid, or a kite? If it's a parallelogram, the opposite sides should be parallel and congruent. Here we have the opposite sides are, these are opposite sides. Okay, the slopes are 3 and 3, that's parallel. The lengths are 10, radical 10 and radical 10, that's congruent. So far so good. The opposite sides are parallel, the opposite sides are congruent. Let's look at the other pair of opposite sides, QR and PS. Negative 3 and negative 3, that's parallel. 2 radical 10, 2 radical 10, that's congruent. Okay, so once again, this is a parallelogram. So it's not a trapezoid, and it's not a kite. So it's a parallelogram. So the question is, can we get more specific Is it a rectangle? Is it a rhombus? Let's start with rhombus because that's the easiest. Right? We know it's a parallelogram. If it's a rhombus has 4 congruent sides. So is this a rhombus? No, it's not a rhombus. It does not have 4 congruent sides. These are different. Okay, well maybe it's a rectangle. So, is it a rectangle? Remember, if it's a rectangle, what's the definition of a rectangle? Definition of a rectangle is it's a quadrilateral with 4 right angles. Okay, so here's my rectangle. If this is a rectangle, it's going to have 4 right angles like this, 90 degrees, 90 degrees. Okay, that means consecutive sides like these should be perpendicular. So, if the one side has slope 3, and then the next side has slope, well, before I even look at that, if one side has slope 3, if these are perpendicular, what should be the slope of the other side? It should be negative 1/3. Remember, if it's going to be perpendicular like this, the slope should be opposite sign and reciprocal, 3/1, 1/3. But that is not what we have. All right, we have 3, but then we have negative 3, not negative 1/3. So that means these are not perpendicular. That means these are not 90-degree angles, which means this is not a rectangle. So it's not a rectangle. That means our best classification is parallelogram, and we just have to mention why it's not a rectangle and not a rhombus. Okay, let's see. Okay, so we're going to say it is a parallelogram. And in our explanation, we will just mention the definition of parallelogram. Now, you might notice that I just cut and pasted this from problem number 4. Because problem number 4 was also a parallelogram, so you're going to say the same thing. Yeah, it is a parallelogram because both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. Okay, 3, 3, negative 3, negative 3. But remember, when we say something is a parallelogram, we have to say why it's not a rectangle and not a rhombus, because that would be more specific. So you can either say it in words, which I'll do at the end, but that's optional. If you prefer, you can just indicate why it's not a rectangle and not a rhombus on the diagram. And I personally think that's quicker. This is the part that tells me that it's not a rhombus, okay, because these are not the same. So I can just circle these and say not a rhombus. Okay, if this were a rhombus, these would be congruent. It's the slopes that tell me that this is not a rectangle. So I could circle these and say not a rectangle. And obviously the reason is because they are not reciprocal. And if you wanted to write, add on there that they're not reciprocal, that's even better. Okay, if you prefer to write your sentences, you can do that. Okay, I overlapped those a little bit. Let me move this over. Okay, if you prefer your sentences, you could write, it is not a rectangle because consecutive sides are not perpendicular. it's not a rhombus because it does not have 4 congruent sides. So you can write it out in words if you prefer. Okay, so that is how you classify a quadrilateral as one of the 7 special quadrilaterals.